Hello and welcome to the Unnamed Automotive Podcast. My name is Sami Assad, and with me, as always, is my good friend and fellow automotive journalist, Benjamin Hunting. Say hi to the people, Ben.
Greetings, corporeal and non-corporeal listeners.
Greetings to everyone. If this is the first time you're listening to our podcast, thank you for trying something new. I will reiterate, Ben and I are a pair of automotive journalists, but more important than that, we're very good friends. Isn't that right, Ben?
That is mostly accurate.
We're such good friends that I like Ben to take the lead on the podcast right now and tell people where they can find his latest work. Can you do that for me, Ben?
Sure, you can find my work at Motor Trend, at Car and Driver, and at Inside Hook.
And you can find my work at autotrader.ca, driving.ca, and Electric Autonomy Canada.
Oh, I have a new one. Sammy, I forgot to add. My first piece for JD Power just went up this week, so you can find me there too.
What does the JD and JD Power stand for?
I wish I knew. They said that it'll be years before they'll even tell me.
I honestly think that should be the first, story anybody has to write for them. That should be the audition for every writer that's pitching them. Write me a story about what the JD stands for.
You have to audition?
Yeah. They ask for headshots.
I do a swim test.
Yeah. They put me in front of a green screen.
If I could swim across the lake and back.
What lake?
It doesn't matter. Closest lake.
Any lake.
Closest lake.
Good. Ben, we've got some cars to talk about today.
Yes.
Are you sure you want to talk about them, or you want to talk about this lake?
No, I'm done with the lake.
How deep is this lake?
Sammy, you can't think about how deep the lake is if you hope to, rise to the challenge.
Actually, sorry, I want to talk about your JD Power publication. What did you, first of all, I know JD Power for sending a bunch of people surveys and then writing information about those surveys that were really, early on in my career, there were extremely useful surveys about, for some of the features that I was writing, especially about infotainment systems and vehicle reliability. Right?
Yeah, it's a lot of customer data, they put together a bunch of information about the kind of stuff that we don't get to do, which is talk to owners after they've owned their vehicles for a little while. And they do things like, they call it stuff like the appeal study and the initial quality. And it's trying to see how happy people are with their cars after the first year, or how happy they are after a certain period of time. And digging kind of deeper into that, it's like, which features are the ones that are most annoying or the ones that cause the most problems. I think that's kind of where their focus was for a very long time.
And what we do is almost the opposite. People come to us first. Yeah. They tell us what they want. We tell them what they get. And then hopefully they take our recommendation. And then we never hear from them again, whether or not they're happy or not, whether or not they took our advice or not. And then I never hear from them again. And it's great. I think it's a really neat interaction we have with people. But I like the idea of having the other way around, where you get to hear from owners and find out what's working, what isn't working. And then in that case, we'd be able to find out exactly, we as critics, we get to drive all these cars that have similar features or different features, and we decide what we like and what we don't like. For example, a lot of people didn't like touchscreen HVAC controls or touchscreen volume controls, right?
And a lot of people don't like the infotainment system that Mazda has, for example.
Yeah. And I think in reality, if you get some of these systems are actually fairly useful if you get used to them, right? Like the learning curve for them is really steep, especially for somebody who gets in and out of so many cars. And we just think that the car should be intuitive from the get-go. I shouldn't have to learn anything about it. And then it should just be...
you know why we think that? Because cars used to be intuitive from the get-go.
Right.
That's the thing. When you started, cars from maybe 30 years ago, they pretty much did one thing, and that's drive. And drive and be comfortable.
Yeah, now they have to entertain us.
Well, it was like drive and. So it was drive and be comfortable, drive and be practical, drive and be sporty. Now it's like they have to do the drive and, but they also have to encompass this whole digital world that they didn't have to before. And I think that part of what you see with these JD Power surveys and other similar surveys is that it's not always... When people complain, it's not always because a feature doesn't work how it's designed to work. It's because the customer doesn't want that feature, or they don't like how that feature is implemented.
Yeah.
So it's a helpful road sign in that perspective too. So when you see someone sometimes these surveys can be easy to misinterpret because you'll see a survey and it's like, oh, people are unhappy with their BMWs or they're unhappy with their Lexuses. And it's not necessarily because the Lexus has problems. It's because these cars are so complex now and there's so much going on, especially in the luxury segment, that it can be hard to understand how to use them properly. And people can get easily frustrated with a vehicle that is too complicated to fit into their daily lives. And I think that that's where you see a lot of complaints. As systems have gotten more complicated, people are getting more and more frustrated. And that comes to the data becomes analyzed as it being a problem with the car or rather than a dissatisfaction with the feature. Right.
I think we'll talk a little bit more about infotainment systems and digitization of a car experience later on in the episode. But I want to jump into a review that I'm sorry to change gears so dramatically. It's like we're going from one gear to another now. But
just as long as you don't grind my gears, Sammy.
I think this is gonna grind your gears for sure. I recently drove a brand new vehicle, and I was put under a gag order to not talk about it until now. So, and I listened. I drove the new generation Chevrolet Traverse. I believe it's a 2024 model year vehicle, and the Chevy Traverse is a 3-row crossover that I think is actually really underrated. It's been around in some form for a while. I think this is the third generation.
For a really long time.
And I think a lot of people overlook the Traverse, even this last generation one that got completely rehauled. It's a pretty good vehicle. It was a fairly good vehicle, and I think it was reasonably priced and did some of the basics really, really well.
So what happened was, I mean, GM got out of minivans, right?
Yeah.
Everyone kind of got out of minivans in North America, except for Chrysler. And right around that time, they had that thing called the Uplander, which was like kind of a minivan, but not a minivan at the same time. And
it certainly looked like a minivan, didn't it?
It certainly did, but it had, I think, the taller, this is in the late 2000s, I want to say, mid 2000s. It kind of had that taller ride height, and that was like the transition vehicle between minivans and the Traverse. The Traverse was the full-size, 3-row, I say full size. I'm sure some people call these mid-size, but to me, it was a full-size crossover in the sense that it was pretty darn big inside. And for what it was good. It was a vehicle that for a long time, like a good 10-year stretch, I could recommend people check out the Traverse or the Acadia or the Buick Enclave because they were useful, they were basic, they had good power, and you could get comfortable versions if you wanted to. It was a very versatile vehicle. And then that kind of changed when they redesigned it. Things got a little muddier. But I'm curious as to what it is now, Sammy. Like, do you feel that the current Traverse has anything to do with that original version?
The current Traverse does not have a lot to do with that original version. I still think that there's something here that is really attractive to customers for a 3-row vehicle. So let me break down the major changes here. First of all, there's no longer a V6 engine offered on the vehicle at all. This car is turbocharged 2.5 liter 4-cylinder engine only.
You used to be able to get a Turbo 4 on the previous gen, right? It was an option, I think.
I didn't. You know what? I looked into that because it felt like it was right, but I couldn't find that.
I think it was not popular. It was a 2-liter turbo.
And this engine makes some pretty good horsepower, 328 horsepower and 326 pound-feet of torque. It can tow 5,000 pounds, which is something I did not test and don't know how that will feel. In addition, if you look at this crossover, it doesn't look like the old Traverse in any way or form. In fact, if anything, this looks closer to GM's real SUVs or full-size SUVs like the Tahoe or Suburban. And I think this is the major personality change that's going for the Traverse in terms of what it is.
Now, I've read that this Traverse, in terms of dimensions, it's almost identical in size to the model it replaces on the outside.
Right. And on the inside.
Okay, that's not a bad thing. I mean, we always complain about vehicles getting bigger. The Traverse didn't get bigger. I think that's maybe a win.
That is maybe a win. It is also still one of the most spacious vehicles in terms of overall cargo room in the class, which is pretty good. It's got like 98 cubic feet of cargo space in the vehicle with all the seats folded down.
That's the same, or actually maybe a little bit more than a Toyota Sienna.
Yeah, it's huge.
Which is fantastic for a crossover.
isn't the Sienna the worst of the minivans?
It is, but that's still a lot of room for a crossover. Like, right? Like that's what is it? I think a Suburban is like 140 for the extended wheelbase.
Yeah.
And I think 118 or 120 something for the standard. So this is a substantial vehicle inside.
So we've got a new engine, lots of power. We've got the same amount of space in the same little like exterior package. One of the things I think people are going to notice is the exterior design, which I pointed out, much more squared off, but not too much so. It really does remind me of the full-size SUVs. And what will really push that impression further is that it's now offered with a Z71 package or trim level. There's only 4 trim levels of the vehicle, and one of them is the Z71, which you'll recognize on the SUVs on the full-size SUVs is an off-road-ish kind of package.
Yeah, it gives you like skid plates and low range 4-wheel drive and that kind of thing. You know, GM did this kind of with the Acadia, right? You could get an AT4 package last year. And I think that the Acadia is the same platform as the Traverse, and it just came out a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, but I don't think it had that engine. I don't think it had that 2.5.
That I don't know.
So the thing about the Z71, it comes with all-terrain tires. It has a unique front end. It is slightly taller in terms of ground clearance. Sorry, it has more ground clearance from both the all-terrain tires, which are on 18-inch wheels, and a slightly hiked up suspension.
Let me just clarify. So the AT4 version of the Acadia, it's the previous generation that's still on sale.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, sorry, I was saying that suspension ground clearance is now at 7.9 inches, which I don't think is that awesome.
So that's 7.7 inches shorter, 0.8 inches shorter than the base Subaru Crosstrek in my driveway right now.
Yeah. It does have skid plates underneath, the aluminum, I think, up under the front, and then steel under the body.
Nothing says strong like aluminum.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to crush a can the other day. I busted my hand so bad.
I mean, you're not supposed to use your hand. You're supposed to use a sledgehammer.
I know.
You gotta Gallagher that can.
And it has, I think, some unique off-road modes that are designed to help you go off-road. Of course, this is not meant to be a rock crawl or anything like this. In fact, I'm always so like skeptical of how off-road oriented these trims are. We've talked about this before on the past on past episodes, and I think this does look the part of an off-roader, but doesn't totally play the part of a real off-roader.
No, I mean, I'm looking at
anything.
Sorry, go on.
If anything, this is more like a vehicle that might help you, like manage on some muddier trails, or like to a campground or a cottage,
which literally any vehicle could do. And I'm looking at a picture of the Z71, and you look at that front bumper and how low it is.
Yeah.
That's like my first thought when I see this, and I think off-roading. It's just, and there's so much plastic down there. It just really seems like a bad time.
If you're going to grow over anything. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's interesting too is you look at the styling of the Z71, and the headlights are right at the top. They're these thin gun slits that kind of cut into the fenders. And then the rest of it is just like straight up grill.
Yeah.
Couldn't they have sacrificed some cooling maybe for a more manageable bumper situation?
Maybe. Who knows? It is all turbo now, right? All turbo 4. So we also drove I drove this. They gave us a very mild off-road course. Basically, they told us to drive it on a field and then into a forest, and that was it, really.
How many made it out of the forest?
Everyone made it out. There was no confusion. It worked pretty well. There were a couple of I don't know if it was like rutted paths or maybe just cracked sort of or rocky sort of trails in the forest, but it managed okay. I would have been totally comfortable in almost any other SUV I've driven. Maybe not a minivan, sure, but I don't think this was meant to showcase just how off-road capable this vehicle is, right?
So I want to ask you about the drivetrain, because this is not a light vehicle. Yep. It's just under 5,000 pounds, and it has a Turbo 4, and those two things together kind of scare me a little bit. So how does
they've
it feel?
changed this powertrain? So this 2.5 is, from what I understand, is very closely related to the other 2.7 liter 4-cylinder turbo.
Yeah.
And however, the old model, I believe, used to have, or other vehicles with the 2.7 typically have, I think, a 9-speed auto or a 10-speed auto. And this one just has an 8-speed auto. And honestly, the powertrain is okay. It's not super fast. And that is adequate, I think, given the competition. I think we've discussed the V6s in some of the other vehicles in this class. Something like the Palisade, and the Telluride are very decent engines, but nothing like world beating, right?
Well, I think the whole idea of this class of vehicle is you're not going to get anything spectacular. I think that this is a vehicle you choose because you need to choose it, much like a minivan. And I'm not saying they can't be good, but I don't think that there's any model in this class that stands out as being incredible at any one thing when it comes to driving, with the exception maybe of the sporty Explorer with the crazy. You could get. Did that have an
400 horsepower one or something?
Yeah, the V6 in it. Yeah,
and then there's also. Sorry, I also want to give some credit to because I thought I wasn't going to like it, but I did. The Grand Highlander has this hybrid max powertrain that does 0 to 60 in 5.5 seconds, and it just hauls, man. It just kicks butt. That's the only thing it's good at. It's not good at fuel efficiency at all, but that thing hauls.
So you're saying this is adequate?
It's adequate. I recently drove a Honda Pilot. There's nothing about the Pilot and its V6 that stood out to me over this 2.4 turbo. It just does the job.
So the turbo engine is something that I'm kind of curious about. I don't necessarily know if you have this answer, but I'm looking at the fuel economy. I'm trying to figure out why you go turbo, right? So
the fuel economy is not a massive improvement over the old one.
It's not an improvement whatsoever.
Yeah.
So if you are getting a front-wheel drive version, a four-wheel drive, front-wheel drive 2024, combined fuel mileage is 23 miles per gallon, which is 2 miles per gallon better than the previous model. But if you get all-wheel drive, it's 21 miles per gallon combined, which is a 1 mile per gallon increase over the old V6.
Minute difference, right?
Super minute difference. Much more complexity under the hood, much more heat being generated, maybe a little bit more power than the V6 had, but...
Yeah, it's the torque, obviously, that really kills it here.
Sure, but I think there was probably under 300... Probably under 300 pound-feet in the previous model.
Yeah, and this one now is 326. That feels great.
But you're telling me that the performance is just adequate. So... What are we doing here? Like, I want to know, but let's broaden this conversation to include this class of vehicle. We're making these large people movers. Yeah. We're giving them turbo engines because why? I don't know, because it's not giving us better fuel mileage really in any meaningful aspect. Perhaps it's useful for GM on their whole fleet average fuel economy for corporate, regulations they have to meet. Mm-hmm. But for the individual buyer, I'm not necessarily seeing the advantage. And do we really need more torque when we could have made these vehicles lighter, perhaps? I don't know.
They're not the only guys that have gone forced into turbo.
I'm not singling out GM. We're talking about it here. So
the Subaru Ascent has a 2.5 turbo, which makes sense to me because I think Subaru doesn't have any more V6s or 6-cylinders.
They never had a 6. Like they had They had the 6 in the B7 Tribeca like 15 years ago.
Back in the day, they had it on an Outback, the H6 or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then you've got a Turbo 4 in the Highlander, and then a naturally aspirated Hybrid 4 in the Highlander Hybrid.
Yes.
Then you've got V6 hybrids in the Grand Highlander and the Ford Escape. Right? Yes. So I think they're not the only ones that have gone turbocharged in 4 cylinders.
No, but why did they do it?
Like, is it for that torque? Is it for that towing capability? I don't know. I don't think so.
I don't think the power difference is different.
It must be easier for them to utilize this 4-cylinder or redesign this 4-cylinder. Maybe it's a future thing.
It could be they just don't want to make that V6 anymore, and they have assembly line space. This is, like you said, this is a version of the 2.7 for the pickup, so it's easy for them to just pull that off. Maybe it's cheaper.
Is there a 6 still offered on the pickups? Is that really weird that we don't know?
I think you can still get the 4.3. I don't know. I will check it out because I know you still can. Remember we were talking last week about the Ram and how Ram has gone to this Turbo 6 and it doesn't have V8s anymore, but you can still get the 3.6 Pentastar.
Right.
So right. I'm going to check and see if Chevrolet allows you to do that.
Now, I didn't just drive this Z71 on some fields. I also drove another trim. Yeah, I drove. I'm very sure. I drove another version of the Traverse called the RS, which featured much of the same running gear. It has a slightly different all-wheel drive system. You've probably heard this all-wheel drive system discussed in several other vehicles. It has what is known as a twin clutch all-wheel drive system, which is kind of like one of those more advanced torque vectoring, rear axle torque vectoring systems that can send more power to an individual wheel at the rear of the vehicle. Why is it on this vehicle and not the off-road oriented one is not totally clear. I think that's when you want better torque vectoring when you're dealing with slippery conditions.
Yeah, it does seem a little bit strange. I mean, it might indicate that it's not capable of dealing with certain levels of torque or wheel slippage.
Yeah. In addition to that, they have different dampers on these vehicles. Not anything super fancy like Magna Ride or anything like that, but they're just meant to be a bit more smoother, better at handling body control, which I think the vehicle does reasonably well. As I mentioned, I recently had a Pilot, and I found the Pilot's body control to be fairly good, if a little bit too much lateral roll. I found this one to be a little bit better than that, and that's it. I mean, this RS model rides on 22-inch wheels. It's fairly well equipped, but there's a couple of other things that I really want to talk to you about, which I think helps the Traverse stand out in this segment, which is full of really good cars. As you mentioned, we already talked about the Telluride and the Palisade, those Korean twins that just dominate this discussion all the time, right?
Yes.
And then there's the popular choices, I think, in the segment, which is the Highlander. I think it's still one of the most popular choices in the segment, and probably the Escape. So how do you stand out against...
You mean Explorer.
Sorry, Explorer, right. How do you stand out in this segment, this really crowded segment that has a lot of great conversations going? I think you've got to do something that's exclusive to GM, and they did that. Listen, they offer Super Cruise now on the Traverse.
I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
That is a big deal, and we tested it out. It's been apparently upgraded to work on more roads, more highways, and even undivided highways, which is very unique as well. So I tested that out. It worked very well. And again, I think it's very cool when you drive any vehicle with Super Cruise, you end up asking yourself, why doesn't every GM product just have this? And it gets frustrating. I was super frustrated with the fact that they don't.
Well, it's because like when the initial rollout happened, it was aimed exclusively at Cadillac. Right. And it was kind of these things where it was like a gee whiz feature, the kind of thing they needed to go up against BMW and Mercedes, who have not quite as good semi-autonomous driving systems in their own vehicles. Mm-hmm. And I think that original framing really it created a roadblock in terms of getting it towards other brands. That would be my thinking. I want to go back to the V6 conversation we were just having. You cannot get it with the Silverado anymore.
The 4.3.
The 4.3 is gone. It's the Turbo 4 is the base model. And I was looking at the 2023 Chevrolet Traverse RS. It had 266 pound-feet of torque and 310 horsepower.
So a little bit more horsepower, but actually, way more torque.
Less, yeah. But it was also 6.8 seconds, 0 to 60. Which was slow. No, but which is faster than the V6 and the Jeep Grand Cherokee L, which was like 8 seconds 0 to 60, which is I was not expecting.
The Grand Cherokee L is a big vehicle.
Yeah, but so is the Traverse, right? They're the same kind of idea as like a 3-row big mid-sizer.
But that's the difference, I think. I think the Grand Cherokee L is like this. It's like a totally different platform. I think it is like a truck-based platform.
No, it's unibody.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's unibody. It's always been unibody. There was like a brief period of time where they had some kind of like chassis that was, I think, extended unibody, but it's always been unibody.
It's a weird platform to me. I don't know. I think it's a bit compromised.
What's weird about it? What's freaking you out about the
I don't know. I don't want to talk about it.
All right, okay.
Anyway, so we talked about this Super Cruise system, and then I want to talk about one more thing with the Traverse that I think will help it stand out. It has a standard 17-inch infotainment system. It is probably the largest base screen you can get in this segment, and because I think there might be bigger screens in higher trim level vehicles.
Remember when like a 17-inch CRT computer monitor was inconceivable?
Yeah, I had one of those. It was great. I loved it so much, and the resolution on that thing was great too.
Oh yeah, the refresh rate. 60
the
hertz.
only oddity with this infotainment system is that it uses a new operating system. It uses an Android Automotive operating system, and you might have heard a little bit about this because it was blamed, I think. A lot of the Blazer's early teething issue, the Blazer EV's early teething issues, were blamed on this Android Automotive OS.
I didn't know they were blamed on the OS so much as they just were electronics problems in general.
Yeah. And I didn't encounter any significant issues. I did have some really weird. I mean, it required a learning curve, as we talked about earlier in the JD Power thing. It has a unique layout that is different than I was expecting. It very heavily integrates Google Maps into its system, which is again something that you need to be comfortable with.
Can I run Android Auto? Sorry, I don't.
As far as I understand, you can, yes. Wireless Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. And then it's also got a really big, this model in particular, the RS has a big, I believe it is, I got to double check the size of it, but I think it's a 12-inch gauge cluster, digital gauge cluster, which I really appreciate these vehicles that can showcase either Android Auto information on the gauge cluster, which I think is really cool, or show you a map in that gauge cluster, which I also think is very important.
I just want to be able to break free from whatever constraints are being put on me by the OS if I want to use something I'm more comfortable with. I think that's
like Waze or whatever else, right?
I think that's an important consideration that automakers need to consider if they really want to be going up against smartphones in terms of the features and software they're providing. Smartphones offer something called choice, and car companies, as far as my experience has been, that they want to lock you into whatever ecosystem they have arranged due to the various deals they have with other software companies.
And it makes little sense to have your phone is frequent. I think your phone is frequently updated. The apps on it are frequently updated. They work on the Android Auto or Apple CarPlay like ecosystem, and then to introduce a new ecosystem where you have to do that, and the hardware on that might not get the same updates, or might not be like, you can get you can get like Spotify or SiriusXM on your Android device and stream that through Android Auto. But if you have an Android Automotive OS in your car, those apps might not be approved for use on that infotainment system. Yeah. Which is stupid, right?
Yeah, it's just we're starting to get into a world that's defined not by customer want or need, but by licensing deals.
Now let's talk about customer want or need. There's one more thing I wanted to discuss with you about the Traverse, and that is the transmission. We talked about the transmission a little bit. Many cars offer something called low range, or L, I believe.
You love L. You're always talking about the L button on every car you're driving.
I have never discussed the L button before.
Put it in L. That's you should get that tattooed somewhere.
The Traverse has the L mode, which is its replacement for an M mode, which I suppose is for manual.
L mode or Elmo?
L mode.
Okay.
And you can change gears when you put into the L mode with the paddle shifters on the steering wheel.
So I have to push a button before I can use the paddle shifters?
It seems so, yeah.
What?
Or maybe it'll change gears for you. Now, L is located on the steering wheel. I need to tell you this.
How often am I going to be using this button? I feel like the steering wheel should be where the important buttons are that I need all the time.
L.
Like voice commands or volume for the stereo.
Yeah, those are there. They're hidden behind the steering wheel and underneath the paddle shifters.
What if
something that caught me off guard? I didn't realize they were there.
What if I have big, thick hands and I can't wedge them between those two things?
I don't know what to tell you. L mode is on the steering wheel. I think this is because they've changed the shifter design. It's no longer on the center console. It's on the column, and it's this electronic shifter, and it's different than what it used to be. And I was so perplexed as to why this button needs to be on the steering wheel. It's not like I'm always throwing it into L for any particular reason. I was so confused. It was a very strange decision. I'll tell you that this car starts at at just under $40,000 for the LS model, and then tops out at just around $55,000 for the RS model. And in between there, of course, is a range of price points. There's a Z71, which comes with all-wheel drive, as far as I can tell, at $47,700, really.
And how do those prices compare to the competitors we've been talking about?
I think it's fairly competitive. The basic model, I think is the best value, obviously, because you get all of these really neat basics. You got that 17-inch screen, you've got all that 98 cubic feet of storage space, and those are the basics, I think, for a three-row crossover. The top trim ones, I'm not super sure about if I feel super comfortable recommending a $55,000 crossover, but it does come with Super Cruise, which is hard to beat.
Can you get the Super Cruise as an option on other trims, or is it only on?
As far as I understand, you can't.
That's a bit disappointing.
Yeah. No, sorry. Going with the LT, you can get it as an option on the second trim level, the LT.
Okay. So would you recommend any version of this vehicle?
Yeah, like I said, it has a killer feature in Super Cruise, and it also has a passive feature that you don't have to pay extra for in terms of the space. So I think those two features alone help it stand out.
Is this a vehicle that is more we've often talked about these kind of placeholder crossovers that aren't bad, they're not good, they're just there, and you can buy them if you want, but it's not something we would tell you to buy. I'm speaking specifically about the Subaru Ascent. And
the Pathfinder, I think.
Yeah, vehicles that are like that. So is this in that class, or is it above that class?
I think it's above that class. Like I said, there's some cars in this class that have a reason to buy it. For example, the Highlander Hybrid and the Ford Escape Ford Explorer both offer hybrid powertrains.
Yeah, but I think didn't I drive the Highlander Hybrid and have not great fuel mileage from it?
I think you drove the Grand Highlander, which had awful fuel efficiency, but tons of power.
All right.
Which is great. And then you've got the Kia and the Hyundai, which have a lot of features, some of which that are not available on the Traverse. For example, rear vented seats are one thing that I like to point out is very, very, or massage front seats. Are very unique to those vehicles that you can't get on the Chevy. But Super Cruise helps this vehicle stand out and makes it, have a reason to purchase it.
Okay. So shifting gears again, see how I just borrow your segues and make them my own?
That's what makes us a good team, I think.
Yeah, it's all about just constant intellectual theft.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about another vehicle that's in the same price range as what we're talking about. And it's a vehicle that you have driven semi-recently, so I'm not going to talk too much about it because I don't want to cover the same ground. But it's the BMW X2. And I drove the X20, the xDrive 28i, which is the entry-level model. I believe that's the same one you drove.
Yeah.
Now, we're on record as having like the previous generation X2, which was very much like a hot hatch from BMW. And then they came around with this new version.
Which is very much not like a hot hatch.
Not at all a hot hatch.
Yeah.
So,
but more like a lifted sedan.
What I want to speak about with this vehicle, and this is a revelation that it took me a full week to realize as I was driving it. This is the least BMW feeling BMW I've ever driven.
Okay.
It does not come across as being from the same family as an X3 or an X5. Or any of the BMW crossovers, or of course any of the sedans, even though it's similarly sized to some of the four-doors. It really feels, I think you could feel the mini platform that it's sharing with other parts of the company. And I'm not saying this is necessarily a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah.
But it caught me by surprise because I can't remember the last time I drove a BMW that didn't feel like it had some of that corporate fun baked into it. Whether that, and I'm not saying that every BMW is a good vehicle that is, the version, whatever version is in its class is the one you should buy, because they're not necessarily competitive across the board, but there's usually something about them, whether it's power or handling or styling, that is a bit of a standout. And I think that this version of the X2, the base model, does not stand out in any way. It comes across as competent, but when you're driving it, it doesn't feel special or unique.
That is a reasonable response after I drove it as well. I think you're onto something with that. I remember feeling like that powertrain had a lot of juice to it.
It's very
For a
normal.
for a four-cylinder turbo, it gets away with a lot, man.
Hey, for a 4-cylinder turbo, it produces less power than what you had in your Traverse. I mean, this is a vehicle.
It's a smaller turbo.
It has 241 horsepower from a 2-liter turbo.
But we've always said BMW's horsepower numbers are
sure, but that's 80 horsepower less than the Traverse. I'm not saying there is a 312 horsepower version of this, the M35, and maybe if I drove the M35, I would feel differently. But this entry-level model of the X2, I'm driving it and I'm struggling to find anything about it in terms of how it drives that would position it above anything else that's similarly sized. I think that some people are going to really like the styling. To me, the styling is very normal. I don't think it stands out, but it's not offensive. I used the vehicle to haul some stuff around. I didn't have any troubles with that. I had to head to the local... in French, they call it something social. It's like a place where you can donate items so they can be resold to people in the community. I had a whole bunch of boxes and I was able to fit them inside the vehicle. It's relatively practical. But the whole time I'm driving it, I'm like, this could be a Ford. This could be a Chevrolet. It's nice inside, but it doesn't come across as super luxurious, and it doesn't have the iDrive system that you're used to. It has there's no button or dial or anything. Like on the center console, there's no real iDrive shortcuts. So you're facing an infotainment system that has kind of been genericized in terms of the interface versus what you would normally expect from BMW. And I think that further sets it apart from providing a BMW experience.
Okay, that's an important thing to bring up. I thought that the drive was fairly good, but I agree with you in terms of how it feels like the Mini, and I think that had been happening with the X1 as well.
The previous X2 did not have that feeling.
No, the previous X2, like we said, they like really stiffened it up, and I think it was really enjoyable to drive. The technology and the cabin is that not enough BMW for you? It's not.
With the iDrive missing, I could have been driving any premium type crossover. I really felt that way.
And by iDrive, you mean that knob?
The traditional any type of traditional hard controls for the iDrive. It doesn't even have buttons, Sammy, for like iDrive shortcuts. They're just not there.
Isn't that crazy?
There might be like one or two, but I'm used to using the back button and like hitting home and Navi and stuff, and none of that's there.
Isn't that wild? That's crazy, right?
I think that that's because you wouldn't see that in a Mini. So they don't necessarily want to create all of that just for a vehicle that already has an interface they can borrow and kind of BMW it up to the point where it looks like what you'd see in a BMW on the screen, but the way you interact with it is different. And, it might only be people like us who drive both of these vehicles regularly, both of these brands, who are going to notice that kind of thing.
Interesting. I want you to tell me a little bit more about how you found that user experience then. Since you've already discussed how you feel about the driving experience, I want you to tell me a little bit more how you felt about this new iDrive, this rotary knobless iDrive. And remember, we had a discussion about all the gimmicky, weird features that they had.
That this vehicle doesn't seem to have. I mean, none that you're talking about the video game stuff and whatnot?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not using any of that stuff when I'm driving this car. I would have liked the dial and the knob. It does make some things easier to use while you're driving. And I liked being able to move back and forth from one sub menu to another. Like how BMW in iDrive will split screens and you can move back from one side of the screen will show one thing and the other shows another, and you can move back and forth between them using the dial. I miss stuff like that. I mean, it's still functional. I don't want to portray this vehicle as somehow lesser than, but it does feel like it's produced by a different brand. And I think that might be a little problematic for BMW. I think we've often talked about how Mercedes-Benz has had a lot of trouble building compact and subcompact products that feel like they're actually Mercedes-Benz vehicles. This is, I think, the first BMW I've driven where it feels like something else, where I'm not getting that. I'm not getting a sense of lineage like, oh yeah, this is just a smaller X3. It does not feel like that whatsoever.
Right. I think that's the biggest thing to say about it. I think that's important.
And
it doesn't feel like it doesn't even feel like a bigger 2 Series Grand Coupe, which was another vehicle that really struggle to have its identity,
So
right?
it's $42,000 in the US. In Canada, you're looking at paying $51,000, I think, for the base model, right around there. You can obviously, as with any BMW, spend a lot of money on options if you want to. I mean, you could. I'm looking at a premium package for $3,100, and this. It's features that are nice to have, but aren't necessary to have, like acoustic glass and auto dimming mirrors and that kind of stuff. You can get active cruise control for another $2,500. There's a winter package in Canada.
Active cruise? You mean like adaptive cruise control?
Advanced driver assistance that includes active cruise control with stop and go, cross traffic alert.
It's insane to me that this stuff is not standard.
Driving assistant professional, which is like, I think that's limited self-driving at certain speeds, that kind of thing.
Yeah. That always bothers. Honestly, that bugs me, man.
It's again, these are all, this is a car that it's really hard to say who this is for. I think if you want the BMW badge, you have this amount of money, you need something that's practical, which this vehicle is. I mean, it's not as practical as it could be because it has that sloping rear roof, but I was able to use it. I didn't really have any issues with the cargo area. So I'm not going to say don't buy this car, but it's not necessarily appealing if you're an enthusiast, that's for sure. And it doesn't feel super luxurious. I think it looks okay. The styling is decent in person, maybe more so than you would see in photographs. Mm-hmm. And mine was finished in a nice blue color, which looked pretty good.
Yeah, you mentioned that. It was one of the first things you sent me a message about.
Yeah. So, it's an interesting vehicle. I'm kind of flummoxed a little bit about how to approach it. I don't know.
I think the biggest thing is, what is the competition like?
I mean, I guess GLB and
the GLB is actually a kind of interesting vehicle, especially because you can get it with a third row somehow.
What?
Yeah.
Is it Q3 a competitor to this vehicle?
I guess so.
I can't really think of anything from Lexus except the UX, and the UX feels smaller.
The UX does feel fairly small.
But, I mean, it's the most Lexus-like BMW, I think.
Which weird statement.
No, but you know how Lexus is the king of providing a competent but unmemorable driving experience?
Inoffensive, yeah.
I feel like this X2 does that. It's like, yeah, it's luxurious in the sense that nothing goes wrong and the power is decent and the ride is relatively comfortable. Mm-hmm. But it's not luxurious in the sense that it stands out.
That's fair. I think that's all it needs. I think we talk about vehicles. I think luxury vehicles need to do a better job of standing out, but the ones that don't at least have to be good at what they do. And it seems like this thing does the basics of, transporting people, well.
For sure. And this is the ultimate expression of a white space vehicle. This is not a vehicle that anyone out there dreams about. This is a vehicle where BMW saw a gap in their lineup, a hole in the showroom, and they're like, we need a crossover of this size to fit into this hole so we can appeal to this segment of customers. And then they looked in their portfolio, they saw that they had many shared platforms with Mini that would allow them to do that in an economical way. Mm-hmm. And the X2 was born. And sometimes you get vehicles like that, and that's just what they are. They're not trying to achieve anything more than that. I think the 35 will probably achieve more than that. I think it will be more interesting to drive. But if you don't have 35 money, you can pick this one up and I guess play pretend. I don't know.
I think that's fair.
The 35, the pricing it's another $10,000, so it's not insignificant.
That bugs me the most because to me, the old X2 M, I think it was called the M35 as well, actually did have some cred. It had some street cred to me.
For sure, I liked it a lot.
And now we've lost that.
Well, I haven't driven the X30, the M35, so maybe it brings it back. But I don't know. It's weird. We're living in a world where minis keep getting bigger and bigger, and now they're big to the point where BMW can just reskin it, and they don't even have to make it all that different.
But we've been saying this about the X1 for a while, right? The X1 is essentially a mini Countryman or a mini.
Yeah, and the X2 is a slightly less practical X1.
Yeah.
And you have to have these vehicles in your lineup these days, or at least car companies feel that they do.
All right. Okay. Anything else you want to talk to me about?
No, I think that wraps it up.
That's it. Our conversation is done for the week.
Yeah, terminated.
Okay. Done. I want to give a quick notice to our listeners that next week we will be taking a quick break. It's
break.
a week-long break. We'll be back with another episode the following week. I am not available for a record next week, so I'm sorry. You can blame it on me, Ben.
I always blame it on you. You don't have to worry. You don't have to assign blame to yourself. I'm taking care of that.
I think accountability is very difficult these days. Nobody gives enough accountability, and I'm stepping up to the plate and I'm being accountable. But when we do catch up, Ben, what are we going to talk about?
I'm going to be talking about a vehicle I've wanted to drive for a very long time, and that's the Kia EV9.
And I'm very excited to hear about that because this sounds like a very important vehicle in the world of electric vehicles altogether. And I'm going to be talking about a car that I've always wanted to drive for a very long time and haven't, despite Ben ruining it for me. And that's the Mazda CX-90.
How did I ruin that for you?
Because you had such an awful time with it.
Didn't I take that to your house?
Yeah, and I never drove it.
All right.
Anyways, you're gonna want to hear those episodes when they come out, and if you don't want to, you don't want to miss a thing, really. And I know you don't want to miss a thing, and the best way to do that is to subscribe to our podcast. I recommend you going to our website, unnamedautomotivepodcast.com, and clicking on one of the buttons at the top of the website. Those take you to whatever is the most popular podcatcher out there, and we'll subscribe for you, assuming you've got an account or whatever is necessary for the function. Or honestly, the easiest way to do it is just go to your podcast client, search for us, Unnamed Automotive Podcast, and hit subscribe. That's the easiest way to do it.
And if you want to reach out to us, did you cover contacting us, Sammy? Because
No, absolutely not. That's your thing. You're the most social of the two of us.
Oh, and yeah, definitely. I'm the guy who lives in the woods. Is definitely the most social of the pair. You can get in touch with us in a variety of ways, and we would like you to do that. You can find me on Instagram. I'm at Hunting Benjamin. Sammy is somehow still on Twitter, which is also called X. He's at Sammy_hot, like you're laughing. Alternatively, you can use the contact us field or form on our website, unnamedautomotivepodcast.com. You just write what you want to send to us, click submit, and it ends up in our inbox. Or you can even email us directly, specifically me, Benjamin at benjaminhunting.com.
Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to you later.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.